I think one of the challenges with RTI, with English language learners, and there are many, is that typically teachers have not had enough preparation on how to work with English language learners, or how to distinguish between learning disabilities and the language acquisition process. So I think it's really important that we provide professional development, not just in the generic components of RTI, how to do progress monitoring, but really what it looks like to support English language learners. I think it's important to understand some of the differences between learning to read in one's first language and learning to read in a second language. The IES practice guide, for example, emphasizes, I believe, the similarities between reading in English as a first or second language. And yes, absolutely there are similarities, but I worry that if we don't help teachers understand the differences, what happens when children struggle is that the teacher assumes there's something wrong with the child if we don't understand what those struggles might look like. So just one example would be phonological awareness. If you are doing phonological awareness activities in English, and English not as your first language, there are going to be sounds, most likely, that aren't in your first language. And we cannot distinguish between sounds that aren't in our language, that we haven't learned before. What that means is the teacher needs to be aware of that on the one hand, so that she can provide more explicit instruction in those sounds to help the child learn to distinguish them, but also, and probably even more importantly, so that the teacher doesn't misunderstand why the student is confused and think that the child has problems with phonological awareness when in fact that's not the case. So that would be a difference between learning to read in one's first or second language. That also, by the way, is something important to understand, that's a characteristic of students with learning disabilities, that's also a characteristic of students acquiring a second language, that it's important to understand. That the one characteristic can mirror the other. And so if we don't realize what's going on, again, we're liable to think the child might have a learning disability when it's really just acquiring another language. I could go on and on with lots of examples with that, but I won't. I think, too, another confusing area is this idea of evidence-based and what it means to be using evidence-based practices. And I think it's important to realize that the practice must have been validated or tried out with similar students, so English language learners, that one size does not fit all. And so, for instance, the National Reading Council report that became the foundation for No Child Left Behind, the authors actually say in the preface that they excluded all of the research on reading in English as a second language, that they didn't look at that body of work because another panel was going to be convened shortly that would look at that body of research. But when we are told about the 5 big ideas, the recommendations behind reading first, we aren't told, well, these actually haven't been tried with English language learners. We really are presented with those ideas as if they apply to everyone. So I think we have to be careful. I think the panel that was convened afterwards points out some very important things for us to understand about reading in a second language. And the example I already gave you about phonological awareness is one of those. I think another area that's really important for us to look at is assessment, progress monitoring. I get asked a lot of questions about this. It's very important to recognize what an individual measure can tell us and what it can't, and to make sure that we're using assessments for the purpose for which they were designed. So if it's a measure designed just to give us a general indication of language proficiency, that isn't something we should be using for progress monitoring, for example. We also need to realize that the ORF score, or oral reading fluency score, that we get, that so often is used as an indicator of needing more intervention, that can mean so many different things. That one ORF score can indicate that maybe the child does need more phonological awareness, more with decoding, but it also could be vocabulary, comprehension. And so I think when we get an ORF score, that's just the start. We then need to collect additional data. And I really think that the information needs to figure out what a child's strengths are that we can build on, as well as just what they need. And I would recommend the work Noni Lasso has done in this area. One of the research studies she's been involved with recently actually shows that the correlation we see between fluency and comprehension among children reading in English as their first language does not hold up with English language learners. And so much of the assessment we do for RTI is based on this idea of there sort of being a high correlation. And in fact, with English language learners, that seems not to be the case, because you can take longer to read and actually understand better, and there's a lot else going on there. So I think that's important. Noni Lasso also points out that we're doing a pretty good job with decoding, with word analysis with English language learners. They get pretty good at word calling, but they tend to lag behind in vocabulary and comprehension, and we're just not doing enough for children's oral language development, vocabulary and comprehension, I think, from kindergarten on, and that's something we need to pay close attention to.